No music, no narration, just the sound of cards being dealt on a wooden table. The specific sound of it, the soft, deliberate slap of each card landing, one after another, in a room that is otherwise quiet, except for the occasional shift of a chair and the low breath of men concentrating on something that matters more than it should. His name was Denny Alcott. He was 47 years old, farmed 840 acres in a county where the winters were long and the summers were unforgiving. And on a Friday night in late January, he was sitting at a kitchen table with three men he had known for most of his adult life, playing a game that had no business being played for the stakes it had reached. The stakes had not started high. They rarely do. They had started, as they always started on these Friday nights, at a modest level that allowed everyone to feel comfortable and nobody to feel threatened. A few dollars here and there. A small piece of equipment, maybe. The kind of wagering that gave the evening a competitive edge without requiring anyone to drive home, having done something genuinely consequential. But the evening had moved, the way evenings move when men with pride and a long winter behind them find themselves across a table from each other, and by the time the final hand was dealt, the thing sitting in the center of that kitchen table was a Massey Ferguson 6180 that belonged to a man named Roy Casper, who had placed it in the pot 20 minutes earlier with the confidence of a man who believed he was holding a hand that could not lose. Roy was not holding a hand that could not lose. When he understood what had just happened, when the cards were face up and the room went quiet with the specific quiet of a moment that cannot be taken back, the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just done something he will spend a significant amount of time trying to understand. Denny Alcott reached across the table and picked up Roy Casper's truck keys, which had been placed next to the pot as confirmation that the wager was genuine. He held them for a moment. Then he set them back down and said he would collect the tractor in the morning. Nobody at the table said anything. The other two men, brothers named Carl and Pete Vogel, who had been watching the final hand with the alert stillness of people witnessing something they know they will be asked about later, left without much conversation. Roy Casper sat at his own kitchen table after everyone was gone, alone, looking at the cards still spread across the surface. Denny drove home thinking about what he had just won and what it was going to cost him. Not in money, in something harder to calculate. The Massey Ferguson 6180 was not, by any objective measure, an exceptional machine. It was 11 years old, with just under 4,800 hours on it, in the condition that results from consistent use and inconsistent maintenance. Roy Casper had run it on his operation for 7 of those 11 years, using it primarily for secondary field work. What the 6180 was for Denny Alcott was specifically and precisely what he needed. Denny's own secondary tractor had developed a hydraulic system failure the previous fall that his mechanic had diagnosed as terminal in the practical sense. The cost of repair exceeded the machine's value. Denny had been operating without a functional secondary tractor since October, managing by borrowing equipment from a neighbor and deferring tasks that were not immediately critical. He had been intending to replace the machine through the spring auction circuit, budgeting carefully for a purchase that his operating line could support without stressing his cash flow through planting season. The 6180 in Roy Casper's machine shed was exactly the category of machine Denny had been planning to buy. Not better than what he had budgeted for. Not worse. Essentially equivalent in market value and practical utility to the machine he had expected to find at auction in March. Denny had not placed the machine in the pot. Roy had. Denny had simply seen what was there and played accordingly. This distinction mattered to Denny more than it mattered to anyone else in that room, and it would continue to matter to him in the weeks and months that followed. He collected the tractor on Saturday morning. He drove to Roy's place at 8 o'clock with his truck and a flatbed trailer, and Roy met him in the yard with the body language of a man who had not slept well and had spent the hours since the previous evening moving through stages of a process that had not yet reached anything resembling peace. They did not have a long conversation. Roy handed over the keys, showed Denny where the service records were kept in the cab, and mentioned two things about the machine's operation: a cold start quirk that required a specific procedure in temperatures below 20 degrees, and a tendency to run slightly warm under heavy hydraulic load that Roy had monitored but never fully resolved. He delivered this information in the tone of a man completing a transaction he was obligated to complete, professionally and without warmth. Denny said thank you. Roy nodded. Denny loaded the machine and drove home. The distance between their farms was 4 miles. After that Saturday morning, it became, for a period neither man could have predicted, something closer to uncrossable. Roy Casper's anger was not primarily about the tractor. Denny understood this, and understanding it did not make the situation simpler. Roy's anger was about the evening itself, about having placed the machine in the pot in the first place, about the specific chain of decisions that had led to that moment, about the version of himself that had believed, sitting at his own kitchen table with cards in his hand, that he was in control of something he was clearly not in control of. Losing the machine to a stranger would have been easier. Losing it to Denny Alcott, a man Roy had known for 22 years, who had sat at that table dozens of times across those years, who would now drive past Roy's driveway 4 times a week on the county road. That was the version of the loss Roy could not easily absorb. Roy stopped returning Denny's calls within 2 weeks of the card game. He was civil when they encountered each other in public, at the co-op, at the elevator, but civil in the specific, compressed way that communicates everything about the distance between two people without requiring either of them to acknowledge it directly. Denny had expected this, or something like it. He had not expected it to last as long as it did. The Vogel brothers had their own version of the same situation. Carl and Pete had not lost anything in the card game. They had not been involved in the final hand beyond witnessing it. But the evening had exposed something between Denny and the Vogels that had not been fully exposed before. Carl Vogel had, the previous summer, borrowed $8,000 from Denny to cover a gap in his operating line during a difficult stretch. The loan had been informal. No documentation, no explicit repayment schedule, the kind of arrangement that exists between men who have been neighbors long enough to trust each other with more than they should probably trust each other with. Denny had not asked for the money back. But the card game had changed the context of the loan in a way neither man had anticipated. Carl had sat at that table watching Denny win a piece of equipment worth more than the loan, and something about that juxtaposition had crystallized into a resentment that did not follow any particularly logical path, but that was real nonetheless. Pete, Carl's younger brother, had no direct financial entanglement with Denny, but Pete's loyalty ran toward his brother by default, and when Carl began creating distance from Denny in the weeks after the card game, Pete followed without requiring a specific explanation. Denny found himself, by mid-February, in the specific social position of a man who has done nothing technically wrong and has lost 3 friendships anyway. 20-plus years of proximity with 3 men leaves marks that are felt even when their absence is not immediately articulated. And the sudden quiet from all 3 was something Denny noticed in the way a man notices a sound that has stopped. The tractor itself performed as expected through late winter and into spring. Denny's mechanic, a careful man named Stu, who had maintained Denny's equipment for 12 years, went through the 6180 thoroughly in February. He replaced several filters, adjusted the hydraulic pressure settings, and addressed the warm-running tendency under heavy load through a straightforward repair that Roy had apparently not pursued. The total service cost was moderate, well within what Denny had planned to spend bringing a used machine into his operation. The 6180 went to work in April. Denny ran it as his secondary unit through planting season, and the work proceeded without incident. The machine was not better than what he had lost. It was essentially equivalent, which was what he had needed and what he had, against the expectations of an ordinary winter Friday night, managed to obtain without spending the cash he had set aside for the spring auction. That cash sat in his operating account through planting season, available for inputs and contingencies rather than locked into an equipment note. His cash flow through planting was the most comfortable it had been in 3 years, and the reason it was comfortable was a card game that no rational farm financial plan would have included. Denny did not feel good about this. He recognized the financial benefit with the mixed emotion of a man who understands that something has helped him and is not sure he deserved the help, which is a different and less comfortable feeling than simply being grateful. The drought arrived in July. It arrived gradually. A dry week following a dry week, soil moisture declining in increments that each seemed manageable until the cumulative deficit became something that individual farmers and county extension offices began describing with increasing urgency. By mid-July, the forecast had been consistently wrong for 3 weeks in the direction of predicted rain that did not materialize. And by the end of July, the county's crop condition ratings had declined to levels the local agricultural press was beginning to compare carefully to years the older farmers remembered specifically and unpleasantly. Roy Casper's operation was particularly exposed. Roy farmed ground that was lighter and sandier than most of the county's soil profile, land that performed well in normal moisture years and degraded faster than average in dry ones. Roy had known this about his ground for as long as he had farmed it and had structured his rotation accordingly, but structural accommodation only goes so far in a drought that exceeds the parameters it was designed to handle. Roy's primary tractor developed an air conditioning system failure in early August during the hottest stretch of the summer, at a point in the season when running equipment without a functional cab climate system was genuinely limiting to productive hours. Roy's dealership quoted a repair timeline of 10 days for the required parts. 10 days in August, in a drought year when every operational hour mattered, was a long time. Roy had no secondary tractor. He had placed his secondary tractor in a card game 7 months earlier, and the man who now owned it lived 4 miles away, and Roy had not spoken to that man beyond the minimum of public civility since the Saturday morning he had handed over the keys in his own yard. Denny heard about Roy's situation through Stu, who heard it through the dealership's service department. Stu mentioned it to Denny in passing without editorial comment. Denny sat with the information for 2 days. He thought about it the way he thought about decisions that were not simple. Not the ones where the right action was obvious, but the ones where several versions of the right action were available and pointed in different directions, and none of them was comfortable. He could do nothing. Roy's situation was not Denny's responsibility. The card game had been a fair transaction between adults who understood what was at stake. He could offer to rent Roy the 6180 for the 10 days. A formal transaction, money exchanging hands, clearly structured as business rather than charity. He could offer to lend it at no charge, which would require Roy to accept something from Denny without a transaction to formalize it, and whether Roy could do that, given the state of things between them, was not something Denny could predict. He drove to Roy's farm on a Tuesday morning with the 6180 on his flatbed trailer and the keys in his pocket. Roy came out of his house when he heard the truck in his yard. He looked at the trailer. He looked at Denny. He did not say anything immediately. Denny said he had heard about the air conditioning. He said the 6180 was there for as long as Roy needed it. He said he was not going to pretend the last 7 months had been comfortable, and that he was also not going to pretend that a man going without a secondary tractor in a drought year because of a card game was something he could drive past 4 miles away and not think about. Roy said he did not want charity. Denny said it was not charity. He said the 6180 had come to him through Roy's decision and that it had helped his operation through the spring in ways he had not expected, and that lending it back for 10 days was the closest thing he could come up with to making the accounting between them feel less wrong than it had felt since January. Roy said the accounting between them could not be fixed by borrowing a tractor for 10 days. Denny said he knew that. He said he was not trying to fix the accounting. He was trying to fix August. Roy was quiet. Then he said to back the trailer up to the shed. The 10 days became 12. Roy's parts arrived on schedule, but the installation took longer than estimated, and Denny told Roy to keep the 6180 until his own machine was ready. Roy returned it on a Thursday afternoon, full fuel, with a brief acknowledgement that it had run well. That exchange was the most substantive conversation the two men had conducted since January. It was not a reconciliation. It was not the restoration of 22 years of proximity. But it was the first exchange in 7 months that contained something other than compressed, necessary civility. Carl Vogel repaid the $8,000 in September after the crop check cleared. He repaid it in full, without being asked, with a check delivered to Denny's mailbox rather than in person, accompanied by a note that said only that the debt was settled and that Carl appreciated the patience Denny had shown in not pressing for repayment during a difficult year. The note did not mention the card game. It simply closed the financial account and left the personal one to settle on its own schedule. Pete Vogel acknowledged Denny at the elevator in October with something more than compressed civility for the first time since winter. They talked for 10 minutes about the drought and the crop and the county's general situation, and when they parted it felt like something had been partially cleared, even though neither had explicitly cleared it. Roy Casper came to Denny's farm in November, unannounced, on a Saturday afternoon when Denny was working in his shop. Roy knocked on the shop door, and Denny let him in, and they stood in the shop for a while, looking at the machinery around them rather than at each other. The way men sometimes find it easier to have a direct conversation when both are oriented towards something else. Roy said he had been thinking about January since January. He said he had been angry in ways he had not fully examined until recently, and that when he examined them honestly, some of the anger was directed at the right target and some of it was not. He said he had put the tractor in the pot. Denny had not asked him to. Denny had played the hand correctly and won it fairly. And the version of Roy Casper who had sat at that table believing he held an unbeatable hand had no legitimate claim on the version of Denny Alcott, who had simply done what a card player does when the cards favor him. He said the August thing, the flatbed trailer in his yard, the 12 days of borrowed equipment, the full fuel on return, had required him to revise something he had been carrying since winter. He said a man who wins a card game is not obligated to show up with the thing he won on a trailer 8 months later, and that Denny showing up anyway was the kind of thing that was hard to stay angry around, even for a man who had been working at the anger for 7 months and had gotten reasonably good at maintaining it. Denny said he had not shown up in August to end the anger. He said he had shown up because it was August, and Roy needed a tractor, and the tractor was sitting in Denny's shed doing nothing. Roy said he understood that. He said that was what had made it hard to stay angry. They talked for 2 hours in that shop. Not about the card game specifically, and not about the months that had followed it, but about the things two men who have known each other for 22 years talk about when they are finding their way back to the ease that 22 years creates. The farm, the season, the county road project, the price of inputs for the following year, the specific and ordinary texture of two neighboring lives that had been briefly interrupted and were now, carefully and without ceremony, resuming. The Massey Ferguson 6180 is still on Denny Alcott's farm. It has been there for 6 years now, longer than Roy Casper owned it, long enough that its presence in Denny's equipment lineup has become unremarkable to anyone who knows the operation. Denny has maintained it with the attentiveness that extends a machine's useful life, the warm running tendency resolved permanently by Stu in that first winter, the cold start procedure now so familiar that Denny does it without thinking, the service intervals kept without exception. Roy Casper has been inside Denny's shop several times since that November afternoon. They have not played cards again, by unspoken and mutual agreement that neither has ever explicitly articulated. They have borrowed equipment from each other in the normal course of neighboring farm operations. They have stood at the co-op counter and talked about crop prices and input costs with the ease of two men who have accumulated more shared history than any single difficult winter can erase. Carl Vogel has never mentioned the loan since the check cleared. Pete Vogel and Denny have the relationship they had before January, comfortable, occasional, low maintenance, the kind common between men who live in the same county and have no particular reason to be close, but no particular reason not to be either. The card game itself has become, in the way that sharp events become in the lives of people who survive them, something that exists in the background of these relationships as acknowledged history rather than active wound. It is not discussed at the co-op or at the elevator. Everyone involved knows what happened, and everyone knows, without requiring the conversation to confirm it, that what happened afterward was the more consequential part of the story. Denny thinks about the card game occasionally. He does not think about it as a victory. He has never thought about it as a victory, and he believes the fact that he has never thought about it that way is probably the main reason the relationships it strained were eventually able to bear weight again. A man who wins something from a friend and treats the winning as a victory has ended the friendship in a way that a borrowed tractor in a shop conversation cannot repair. A man who wins something from a friend and carries the weight of it honestly has left space for something to eventually return. The 6180 starts cleanly now, even in the cold, with a procedure so familiar it has become part of the morning's rhythm. Denny runs it for the same modest secondary work it was always suited for, on ground it was never designed to know, in a county where January nights are long and the consequences of what men do in them are longer still.